She was only 13, a child stepping into the fragile years between innocence and adolescence, when an ordinary spring day in Eastpointe, Michigan, turned into a nightmare her family would never wake from. She walked out into a world that should have been safe, into a neighborhood of quiet streets and familiar faces, and then she was gone. No note, no phone call, not even the trace of a struggle. Just absence, immediate and unrelenting, like a light extinguished without warning. For her family, that moment became endless. Days collapsed into weeks, weeks into years, and still there was no answer. The town carried on, seasons changed, but the silence around Cynthia Jocelyn Zarzycki only deepened, like a wound that refused to close. She was missing, but more than that, she was erased, as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. And then, decades later, the truth surfaced. A truth more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The man who had lived within her circle, a figure of trust and familiarity, was unmasked not as a bystander to her disappearance, but as the predator who had ended her life. Convicted without a body, he carried a secret so dark that even in chains he clung to it, until at last he led police to the place where he had buried her, hidden for 22 years beneath Michigan soil. This is not just the story of a missing girl. It is the story of a family's decades-long torment, of a community haunted by shadows, and of justice delivered in a way so rare, so fragile, that it raises a haunting question. What does closure really look like when it comes too late? And it all began in a place that seemed safe, untouched by such horror, until the day Cynthia vanished.
April 20, 1986, arrived like any other late April afternoon in a small Michigan community. Windows up against a mild breeze, children's laughter bouncing off chain-link fences, the steady rhythm of lawnmowers carving tidy rectangles out of front yards. Houses stood close enough to watch one another's comings and goings. Porches held conversations about school lunches and weekend plans. Cars with decade-old chrome idled at driveways, radios low and familiar. There was a texture to the place then, a softness that made the everyday seem safe. Neighbors whose faces you could name, sidewalks that knew the scuff of 1,000 sneakers, a town that moved at a pace measured in after-school bells and Sunday dinners. Beneath that ordinary pattern lay the small contradictions of suburban life, the hum of distant industry that reminded people of harder work beyond the lawns, the newsprint on stoops whispering about wider troubles, the feeling that the world beyond the city's edge was something you visited rather than lived inside. Yet on this particular day, those contradictions felt remote. Routine wrapped itself around the neighborhood like a familiar coat. Adults went about errands, teenagers traded jokes on street corners, and somehow the ordinary motions made the town feel protected, as if danger belonged somewhere else entirely. It is striking how quickly that protection can be imagined into permanence. When a place looks and sounds like home, suspicion seems misplaced. When everyone trusts the rhythm of their days, the idea of a threat inside those rhythms becomes almost unthinkable. Who, walking past a mailbox or pausing under a sycamore, would suspect that a quiet street could contain the start of a family's worst nightmare? To understand how that ordinary neighborhood held a life, we must first Meet the girl who moved through it.
Cynthia Zarzycki moved through her neighborhood with the quiet certainty of a child who had not yet learned the vocabulary of fear. At 13, she belonged to a world of small routines that felt, to anyone who watched her, like the scaffolding of a life. The walk to the corner, the voice in the classroom, the careful exchange of jokes with friends who knew the exact cadence of her laugh. She was a daughter in a house that kept its doors ajar in summer, a girl whose photographs would later become the only stubborn proof that she had been here at all. There is something fragile and ordinary about that age, an edge where childish things and budding independence meet. In a school picture, a face is arrested between two seasons. In a snapshot on a porch, sunlight finds the outline of a person who will grow taller, who will change her hair, who will make decisions that feel enormous in the moment and unremarkable a year later. Those images, when you look back at them, are less about what she was doing than about what she might have become. A lifetime of small choices waiting to be made. Family scenes fill that space. A table with a half-empty plate. A parent smoothing a school uniform. Someone tucking a note into a backpack. Gestures that, at the time, meant nothing more than care. Friends supplied the soundtrack, whispered plans for weekend rides, the trading of homework and secrets, the confidence that the world they'd been given would stay where they left it. To the people around her, Cynthia was not an item in a file. She was a presence, a voice that threaded through a dozen ordinary conversations. Even absence has texture. The photos her family kept, a birthday cake crusted with candles, a wallet photo tucked away in a drawer, became, after the vanishing, a kind of map. Each image was re-examined for intent and meaning. Each smile interrogated for clues. Memories, once casual, turned sharp. A favorite sweater, the way she braided her hair, the particular nick in a kitchen bowl. Those details, once mundane, became talismans against forgetting. What makes a life worth telling is not only its milestones, but the small, repeating moments that anchor it. The sound of footsteps on a front walk, the rustle of notebooks in a locker, the careless tilt of a head in conversation. These are the things that make a person visible to those who love them. For Cynthia, those textures were constant, and they made the ordinary world feel whole. And then, on a single afternoon that should have blended with countless others, that whole world slipped. April 20th, 1986, was an ordinary spring Sunday in Eastpointe, the kind of day when the air held the first warmth of the season, when families stepped onto porches and children lingered outside just a little longer than usual. For Cynthia Zarzycki, it began as another step into teenage life. Small freedoms, small choices, the kind that marked her growing independence. She left her home that day, expecting to return, never knowing that these simple moments would be the last trace of her presence. The hours that followed were reconstructed only later, in fragments pieced together by investigators. Cynthia was supposed to meet her boyfriend. It was a plan so ordinary, so unremarkable, that no one in her circle thought to worry. But threaded into that plan was a shadow she could not have anticipated. His father, Arthur Nelson Ream, who police would eventually believe had intentions far more sinister than anyone could imagine. Witnesses recalled seeing her, a girl in jeans, hair brushed carefully, walking with the ease of someone who trusted the day ahead. She was seen heading in the direction of a Dairy Queen, a landmark in town where kids gathered, where the exchange of sodas and smiles marked the rhythm of teenage afternoons. There was no hint of danger in her steps, no reason to look back. But then the ordinary sequence broke. She did not return home. She did not appear for dinner. As evening fell and the light drained from the sky, her absence became a sharp silence inside her family's home. The hours stretched unnaturally long, filled with unanswered calls and restless pacing. What had been expected to be a short outing became a night of confusion, and then the first edge of fear. Somewhere in those missing hours, authorities believe Cynthia crossed paths, not only with her boyfriend, but with the man who would later become the central figure in her disappearance. It is in this window, a sliver of time where records blur and sightings thin, that her presence in the world faded. That final day lingers in memory, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so painfully ordinary. A girl trusted her surroundings, trusted the people in her life, and stepped into a day that should have ended like countless others, with a family door closing behind her and the comfort of a safe return. But when that door never opened again, Eastpointe would awaken to a nightmare, and the first frantic search began. In the days after Cynthia failed to come home, what began as confusion hardened into terror. At first, there was hope that she had simply stayed too long with friends, that she would walk back through the door with a nervous smile and an apology. But hours turned into days, and the silence around her became unbearable. Police canvassed the streets, checked the familiar places, and called through her circle of friends. Nothing surfaced. No note, no clothing, no sign of struggle. It was as if she had slipped out of the frame of her own life. As investigators sifted through her last known steps, their attention began to settle on someone no one had thought to fear. Cynthia's boyfriend was just another teenager, but his father, Arthur Nelson Ream, lingered in the background. He was an adult who, authorities would later allege, harbored dark intentions hidden beneath the surface of ordinary family interactions. Investigators came to believe that when Cynthia resisted his advances, she was met not with protection, but with violence. It was a possibility almost too awful to imagine, that the danger had not come from a stranger in the shadows, but from within her own trusted circle. The betrayal cut deep because it was not only an act of violence, but one of manipulation, exploiting a child's innocence and the trust of an entire family. And yet, in those early months, there was no evidence solid enough to anchor the suspicions. No body, no physical trace of where she had gone. Tips dried up, leads unraveled, and the case slipped into the cold. Without answers, the community was left with rumor and speculation, while Cynthia's family bore the weight of uncertainty that never lifted. The crime was chilling, not only because of what authorities believed had been done, but because of the silence that followed. A silence that stretched across years, leaving questions hanging over a family, a town, and an investigation that seemed to stand still. And as the trail grew cold, the search for Cynthia began to move in a new, desperate direction. When Cynthia vanished, the machinery of investigation moved quickly, but not with the tools we recognize today. Detectives knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, retraced her last steps, and pressed photographs into the hands of anyone who might have seen her. Flyers papered telephone poles and shop windows, her face looking out from grainy black and white prints that soon became part of the landscape of Eastpointe. Patrol cars combed the neighborhoods, officers peered into vacant lots, and volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through open fields, hoping for the smallest trace. But every lead dissolved into silence. The technology of the mid-1980s could not provide what her family so desperately needed. There was no national DNA database, no digital surveillance cameras waiting to be pulled from convenience stores, no quick way to trace a missing child beyond the careful notes of officers and the testimonies of those willing to speak. Records were handwritten, evidence sealed away in paper files. The absence of physical proof made each interview, each rumor, feel both urgent and fragile, a flicker of hope extinguished by the weight of uncertainty. As days turned into weeks, the search lost momentum. Detectives remained haunted by her case, but with no body, no clear witness, and no confession, the trail all but evaporated. Over time, newer cases arrived, resources shifted, and Cynthia's name slipped into the long shadows of the unsolved. For her family, though, every birthday, every holiday, and every silent night was a reminder that the investigation had stalled, and with it, their hope for closure. Her case did not disappear, but it waited, cold, quiet, and buried beneath years of unanswered questions. And then, more than 2 decades later, something stirred that silence and forced investigators back to the beginning.
For Cynthia's family, the days after her disappearance became a cycle of desperate hope and crushing silence. Every knock at the door, every ringing phone carried the possibility of news. They pleaded for help wherever they could, reaching out to neighbors, reporters, anyone who might listen. Photographs of Cynthia, a smiling 13-year-old girl frozen in time, became the only way they could keep her presence alive in a world that was moving forward without her. The community felt the weight of her absence, too. Eastpointe was the kind of place where children walked to school, where families trusted the rhythm of their streets. One missing child shattered that fragile sense of safety. Parents began to watch their children more closely. Whispers moved through the town, theories, suspicions, fears. What had happened to Cynthia? Could it happen again? For her family, the grief was not sharp and sudden, but lingering and corrosive. Year after year, they lived with questions that hollowed out their days. Birthdays passed with an empty chair. Holidays carried the heavy silence of someone missing. Anniversaries of April 20th arrived like a wound reopened, each one marked not with closure, but with the ache of time slipping further away. Communities often move on because they must, but for a family left without answers, there is no moving on, only enduring. Cynthia's name remained a plea whispered at vigils, her face held up in photographs, her memory pressed into the minds of those who refused to forget. And as the years stretched on, her story became something else entirely, a cold case that seemed destined never to be solved. The years after Cynthia's disappearance became a slow march of time, each season folding into the next with no answers, no justice, no trace of the little girl who had once filled her home with laughter. Birthdays came and went, marked not by celebration, but by the haunting ritual of remembrance. Her family would gather, not around a cake or candles, but around photographs that never aged, a smile frozen in the innocence of youth while the world around her kept moving forward. Holidays arrived with their empty chair at the table, the silence louder than any spoken word. Anniversaries carried their own weight. Every April, the family was forced to confront the same question that had tormented them since 1986. How could a child vanish without a trace? Neighbors who once remembered the posters began to move away. Streets changed, businesses closed, children grew up. But for Cynthia's loved ones, the timeline never advanced. They lived suspended in uncertainty, trapped between grief and hope. The emotional toll was not just sorrow, it was erosion. Each passing year wore down the edges of their strength. Some days, hope flickered back to life. A phone call from a detective, a story of another case solved decades later, the knowledge that science was advancing in ways no one had imagined back then. DNA technology, databases, new investigative tools, the very things that had not existed when Cynthia vanished now offered the faint possibility that her file might not remain buried forever. Yet with every glimmer of progress came another crushing reminder: time was running out, not for the case itself, but for those who longed to see justice in their lifetime.
Her story lingered like a shadow over Eastpointe, too. Even for those who had not known Cynthia personally, the mystery became a cautionary tale passed from one generation to the next, a reminder that safety could vanish in an instant. What happens to a community when the truth is never found? Fear dulls, but it never disappears. The cold case years stretched endlessly, marked by unanswered questions and the stubborn will of a family unwilling to let her name fade. And then, after decades of silence, something finally shifted.
For more than 2 decades, Cynthia's case remained an open wound, a mystery frozen in time. But in 2008, a stunning development shattered the silence. Investigators closed in on a man who'd been hiding in plain sight all along, Arthur Nelson Ream, the father of Cynthia's boyfriend. Ream was no stranger to the law, but when prosecutors announced that he was being charged with Cynthia's murder, the news sent shockwaves through the community. Even more remarkable was what followed. In June of that year, a jury convicted him, despite the fact that Cynthia's body had never been found. A conviction without a body, something so rare, so difficult, that it underscored just how compelling the evidence must have been. For her family, the verdict was both a moment of justice and a bitter reminder of all they had lost. They knew the truth of what had happened, but they still had no place to mourn. Cynthia was still missing, her final resting place still a mystery. That unbearable void hung heavy even in the face of a conviction. And then, in July 2008, just weeks after being sentenced, Ream finally broke his silence. He led investigators to a quiet patch of land in Macomb Township. Beneath the soil, in a shallow grave, lay the remains of the little girl who disappeared 22 years earlier. It was a discovery that carried both devastation and relief. After decades of searching, Cynthia had finally been brought home. The site was treated with reverence. Investigators, hardened by years of grim work, moved carefully, aware of the weight of every fragment of earth they turned. For Cynthia's family, the grave was not simply evidence. It was the end of a nightmare and the beginning of long-awaited closure. They now had a place to grieve, a place to remember, a place where silence no longer meant absence. The conviction and the discovery marked a turning point both for Cynthia's family and for the history of the case itself. But even in resolution, questions lingered, questions about how one man had managed to conceal such darkness for so long.
He wore the ordinary clothes of a man who wanted to be invisible, a plain jacket, the easy posture of someone who belonged in the neighborhood, the kind of presence that invited no guard. To neighbors, he was a name on a mailbox, a figure in the background of family pictures, someone who sat at barbecues and nodded at passing children. That ordinary surface is important to remember, because it is where the danger hid, not in the lurid image of a stranger, but in the careful, patient camouflage of a man who understood how to make himself acceptable. As the files accumulated and the courtroom lights came on, a very different portrait began to emerge. Prosecutors invited jurors to step behind those familiar gestures and see the pattern beneath, a pattern of intrusion, of small manipulations that added up over time. They traced the moments that on their face seemed mundane, a lingering look, a presence at the margins of teenage gatherings, casual access to a household, and framed them as the architecture of opportunity. In their telling, the suspect's normalcy was not proof of innocence, but a tool, a way to lower suspicion, to place himself inside a child's orbit without triggering alarm. Witnesses, when they were called, painted scenes not of sudden violence, but of slow incursions. People remembered conversations that later felt wrong, behaviors that only took shape as evidence when matched against other recollections. Memory can be slippery, and the prosecution knew this. They did not rely on any single recollection to break the case. Instead, they wove a web of corroboration, inconsistencies in accounts, timings that aligned, statements that shifted under the pressure of scrutiny, until the accumulation of testimony produced a narrative no longer easy to dismiss. Across the aisle, the defense sought to unravel that weave. They urged jurors to treat each thread on its own terms, to regard gaps and uncertainties as reasonable doubts rather than pieces of a larger design. They reminded the courtroom that decades of time could distort perceptions, that stories grow around an absence, and that sorrow can be mistaken for certainty. Their case was not always a bold counter-story. Often it was a steady insistence on the limits of memory and the need for proof beyond conjecture. There was also the impression management that surrounds every man accused of monstrous acts, the way a quiet family history can be presented as normalcy, the way a lifetime of small choices is offered up as character. But character can be both mask and mirror. The prosecution argued that his outward life shielded a private life that included possessiveness and a craving for control, traits that are not easily documented but which leave traces in behavior. Those traces, a readiness to assert authority, a tendency to insert himself into situations where young people gathered, became the soft evidence that, accumulated, felt hard. It is easy to imagine a courtroom reduced to abstractions, lists of statements, notes read into the record. But the human center of the trial was the family who had lived for years with a silence they could not author. Their testimony, when it came, was not the sterile recital of dates. It was the aching recounting of small losses, a missed laugh, a seat at the table that was always empty, a photograph that no longer matched the person who should have been in it. Those human fragments are what turned procedural detail into something moral and urgent. The jurors did not sit across from essays, they sat across from people whose lives had been reassembled around a single absence. Motive, as the prosecution articulated it, was not a tidy line on a chart, but a set of impulses given form over time. It was described as a predatory interest, a pattern of behavior that found both opportunity and familiarity in the same place, and that preyed on trust. Opportunity, the jurors were told, was not merely proximity, but access, the ability to move inside a household's routines without generating alarm. The defense pushed back, reminding the court that proximity alone does not equal guilt, that proximity can be innocent and familiarity can be nothing more than neighborliness in a compact community. Beyond the legal chessboard, there were quieter questions about accountability, about how a person known inside a family can be seen and unseen at once. How does a community reconcile the man who mows his lawn with the harm others say he concealed? How does a family balance their love for what a person once was against the reality of what he was accused of becoming? Those are not questions for forensic reports. They are questions that live in whispered kitchen conversations and in the private notebooks of jurors after the lights go down. In the end, the courtroom was where stories collided, the cumulative testimony of many small moments against the insistence that gaps remained. The trial did not erase the years of waiting, but it forced a public accounting of behavior that for too long had been folded into polite neighborhood life. And when the judge's gavel fell, the case moved from accusation to consequence, leaving behind a family that finally had an answer of sorts, and a community forced to look at the man who had once been part of its ordinary days. The next chapter would be the place where those consequences moved from paper into the earth.
In the summer of 2008, more than 2 decades after Cynthia vanished, the story reached its grim conclusion. In June of that year, Arthur Nelson Ream was found guilty of her murder. The conviction itself was extraordinary, secured without the recovery of her body, relying instead on testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the careful reconstruction of her final hours. It was a moment that seemed to bend time. The unanswered questions of 1986 had finally been spoken aloud in a courtroom, and the weight of years pressed down on every seat in that chamber. For Cynthia's family, the verdict carried both relief and agony. Relief that the man they believed had stolen her life was no longer free. Agony because no ruling could restore what had been lost, and no sentence could fill the empty spaces left in the decades since her disappearance. Courtrooms are built for verdicts, not healing, and in those first moments after the gavel fell, the silence carried more emotion than any words could. Then came the revelation that deepened the wound, even as it brought long-sought answers. In July 2008, just weeks after his conviction, Ream led investigators to a shallow grave in Macomb Township. There, in a quiet patch of earth, lay the remains of the girl who had once lit up her neighborhood with laughter. The discovery was devastating, the final confirmation of what her loved ones had feared since that night. Yet it was also an end to the long torment of uncertainty. For the first time in over 20 years, Cynthia's family knew where she was. They could bring her home. The image of investigators kneeling at that lonely gravesite, the soil turning beneath their hands, stood in stark contrast to the courtroom drama that had preceded it. One was filled with the formality of law, the other with the raw, unshakable reality of loss. For her family, it was not the closure people so often speak of, but something more complex. The return of truth, the end of waiting, and the beginning of grief that could no longer be deferred. As flowers were placed over the grave and her name was once again spoken in the present tense, the community reflected on how long silence can last, and how heavy it becomes when justice takes decades to arrive. And yet, even with the conviction secured and Cynthia laid to rest, questions still linger. Questions about the man who had hidden in plain sight, and what else might remain buried in the shadows.
Justice had come, but it came far too late to protect a child who should have grown into adulthood, who should have been able to dream beyond the spring of 1986. When the verdict was read and Cynthia's remains were finally recovered, Eastpointe gained a measure of closure. Yet, it was a closure carved from sorrow. The family had their answer, but it was bound forever to the knowledge of what they had lost and how long they had lived without her. In the courtroom, the gavel fell with finality, but the echoes of that sound carried far beyond the walls of justice. They reached into a family's home where birthdays had been left uncelebrated, into a community that had carried fear and whispers for decades, into the empty chair that had waited for Cynthia year after year. The truth was no longer hidden. A jury had spoken. A grave had been found. Justice was written into the record, but it was a justice that could never heal the wound of her absence. And so, the case of Cynthia Jocelyn Zarzycki closes not with triumph, but with reflection. Answers were found, but the laughter of a 13-year-old girl never returned. Justice came, but at what cost?
The story of Cynthia Jocelyn Zarzycki did not end with a conviction, nor with the discovery of her grave. Its weight carried on, settling into the lives of her family, her friends, and her community. For them, every year since 1986 had been marked by absence, a birthday without a cake, a holiday without her smile, an anniversary of silence. Even after answers finally came, the rituals of grief never faded. Flowers placed at her resting place became a language of love, a way of saying what words could never capture. For Eastpointe, Cynthia's disappearance was more than a personal tragedy. It was a rupture in the community's sense of safety. Parents who once let their children walk freely now held them closer. Neighbors who once assumed the best began to ask harder questions about who might be hiding in plain sight.
Over time, the lessons of her story intertwined with broader calls for vigilance and awareness, reminders that predators are not always strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they are trusted faces within the circle of the familiar. Her name lives on not only in the records of courtrooms and case files, but in the memory of those who loved her. In every photograph preserved, in every candlelit vigil, in every quiet prayer whispered into the night, Cynthia's presence remains. The legacy she leaves is both painful and powerful, a reminder of resilience, of a family's refusal to give up hope, and of a community's demand that her story not be forgotten. Yet, even as her case reached resolution, one question lingers, one that stretches far beyond Eastpointe. For every family that has an answer, how many more still wait in the dark, carrying the unbearable weight of not knowing?